So lovely to meet you today, Wednesday. I'm Lily. I work at Prolific on the marketing team, and it's really, really great to hear from a customer who's used FindingFive and Prolific together. Please, may you just start by introducing yourself briefly and the kinds of research that you work on?
Yeah, so I'm Wednesday Bushong. I'm an assistant professor at Wellesley College here in the Northeast in Massachusetts. I'm affiliated with both the psychology department and also our program in cognitive and linguistic sciences. So I'm very interdisciplinary. My undergrad degrees are in cognitive science and linguistics, and then my PhD is in cognitive science. So I usually describe myself as a computational psycholinguist, which sounds scary to a lot of people, a lot of big words, but really it just means that I use methods from computer science, psychology, and linguistics in order to understand how people use language. So I'm really interested in the spoken language comprehension side. So what you and I are doing right now, right? So I understand how, or I investigate how people understand speech sounds in real time. So what kinds of information are we extracting from the signal? How do we deal with noise? How do we deal with the fact that there's information coming at us at different time points throughout a sentence? How do we use all that to figure out what sounds someone intended to say? So that's my general research area.
Oh, awesome. And just to help bring the research to life, could you give us like a specific project that you've worked on recently, and what kind of tasks or questions you were putting together?
Sure. Yeah, so in my lab, like I mentioned, we look at how people understand speech sounds in sort of more real life scenarios. So if you were a participant in one of our studies, you might hear a sentence, for example, "I don't mind bees, but I hate wasps more than anything." That's a real sentence from one of our studies. And then we would ask you, which word did you hear in the sentence? Did you hear bees or did you hear peas, right? So these two words are identical except for the sound that they start with. And then we can do a lot of fun stuff, right? So we can manipulate that initial sound to vary somewhere between B and P across a whole acoustic spectrum so that you kind of get biased towards one or the other or are unsure. And then we can also just manipulate other information in the sentence. So for example, in the little sentence I gave you, I mentioned wasps, right? Which might bias you towards thinking, well, bees and wasps being a natural comparison. But I might give you a sentence where instead of wasps, I say squash, right? So now it seems like maybe we're talking about vegetables, so you might be more biased towards thinking that the speaker meant to say pea. So this is a really, really simple task, right? You're just telling me what sound you heard, but it can actually tell us a lot about what's going on subconsciously in your head, right? We can look at, do you rely just on the acoustics of the sound, so the actual wavelengths hitting your ear, right? Or do you also use the context? Do you only use the context if you're unsure of the sound initially, right? We can look at all these different ways that people might be strategizing to understand speech. So that's an example of one of our recent studies.
Nice. And for that study, kind of how many participants were you looking to recruit, and like what kind of participants did you need to validate or figure out that research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when we're studying language, it's so important that we have a particular kind of participant profile, right? So in our case, our recording speaker who's speaking these sentences is an American English speaker. So it's actually really, really important that we have participants who are native speakers of American English. So this is kind of a little known fact, but even though most languages have, for example, B and P contrasts, they're actually a little bit different in every single language. So in Spanish, they are shifted, as linguists would say, they're shifted to the left along the acoustic continuum. So it can actually be hard for example, Spanish speakers to tell the difference between English B and P because they're kind of shifted in this interesting way, and vice versa too. And even different dialects of English can differ on these really simple seeming sounds, right? So even though these sounds are pervasive throughout many, many languages, it's super, super important that not only do you know English, but that you speak it natively, because your knowledge about those acoustic cues gets really, what's the word I'm looking for? Like set in stone within even just the first year of life. So that's where Prolific is really useful, because you can set all sorts of filters. So you can get native language, you can get not only the country where the person is currently living, but you can also get their country of birth. So that's really, really important. We can say, okay, you were born in the United States and you speak English, which is pretty incredible. So yeah.
Nice. And did you have any other demographic criteria that you were looking for? Like, did you want like a spectrum of ages, or was there anything else?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we are mostly focused on just language. One problem with a lot of studies in psychology in general is that they tend to be conducted on undergraduates at the researchers' institutions. You skew very, very young, more educated. Obviously, they're in college, right? And so for our studies, we like to keep it much more open to get a really wide range of ages, education levels, race and ethnicity, gender. So a lot of psychology studies are very female skewed. And so we get a better picture of the average American rather than just the average college student at a liberal arts college, which is not the average American.
Yeah, absolutely. And also with these studies, sort of what kind of timeline are you working towards when trying to conduct them?
Yeah, so depending on how complicated the particular experiment is, usually we're recruiting somewhere between like 40 and 200 subjects. Now with Prolific, that's pretty instantaneous. You can get that many subjects in a day, which is great. You know, if we're conducting these studies in the lab, if you're talking about 200 people, you're probably talking about an entire semester of data collection. You think about the research assistants who have to come in and schedule things, the availability of the subject pool. So with Prolific, that timeline is much, much quicker. So it's very instant gratification. If you have a research question and you have the money, you can get your answer very fast, which I appreciate.
Yes, that is quite a good thing about Prolific. And obviously you choose you choose to run a lot of this research on FindingFive. Is there a reason why you chose FindingFive to set up your questions?
Yeah, well, I got on board with FindingFive pretty early. I should have looked up when they were founded. I'm not quite sure when, but I started using them in 2020. And the initial reason why I started using FindingFive is because it's made by psycholinguists. And so I wanted to support, you know, projects that were spearheaded by my own community, but it's really grown and grown and grown. And so it's much more general than just being targeted towards psycholinguists. But that was sort of my initial reason for joining. Because from the outset, they had all the features that I really needed for my experiments. And I also really appreciate the design interface. So with various experiment programming systems, you tend to have a trade-off between ease of use and experimental control. So if you use something like Qualtrics, for example, that's going to be very user-friendly, very easy to use, but getting the level of control you want over your experiments actually is very, very hard because the design interface is really meant for more basic studies. So you can get there, but it's kind of challenging. On the other hand, you could do, and this is what I did in grad school, is I did all my web programming from scratch, which that gives you maximum control, but then, you know, you have to learn JavaScript, which is not ideal. FindingFive is somewhere in the middle. So it's definitely learnable, but you have a lot of easy experimental control. So it's really great for my undergraduate research assistants. they can learn the basics of FindingFive in a couple of weeks, and they can become kind of pros over the course of just a semester. So that is really the reason why I've stuck with FindingFive, and of course to support my people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, would you be able to illustrate like the kind of task that FindingFive is like really good for?
Yeah, I would say mostly for cognitive psychology studies. That's sort of what FindingFive is aimed at. So a lot of things where you're collecting choice responses, you're showing visual or auditory stimuli, you need to collect reaction times. They support things like mouse tracking as well, so the literal like path that your computer mouse is taking. These are all those like implicit behavioral measures that are really important to us cognitive psychologists, and they just make it really, really easy to do. So I would say that is kind of where FindingFive to me feels pitched at right now. You can, of course, do other kinds of studies on there, but I would say cognitive psychologists are very, very well represented here in the kinds of studies that we do.
Oh, amazing. And obviously, when you set up your study in FindingFive, you'll then take the link and take it to Prolific, and then direct Prolific participants to take the study, and that's how the two connect. But I was just wondering, in general, like what led you to choose Prolific for your research versus other options?
I think, Prolific does a really good job vetting its users. I'm not an expert on the process. I don't know much about it. You know much more than me, I'm sure. But in general, my experience with Prolific users is really, really positive. There are a lot of other recruitment platforms out there. I won't name any names, but some of them are pretty notorious for being filled with bots or participants who aren't really vetted. So you can't actually be sure of things like where they are or their native language. And it just reached a point where the other recruitment platforms were just not giving us good data that we could really trust and rely on. And it was right at that moment where FindingFive integrated with Prolific, and I was very excited about that. So definitely, I had wanted to use Prolific for a long time, but I was so attached to FindingFive because I had done a lot of training with my students on it. I had run so many studies there. I was using the FindingFive participant pool for a while, but it's just such a small platform that the participant pool isn't really there in the way that something like Prolific's is. Yeah, so that's why I use Prolific.
Yeah, it's quite a full-time job managing the design side of research, and then it's a full-time job managing the participant side. So
yeah,
I think it's a good match where both of us come together. And were there any other particular features or aspects of Prolific that you found really helpful for your research?
That's a good question. I mean, the participant filtering is really the big one. I also really like the structure of Prolific. So the way that things are arranged into like projects, and then you have your experiments within your projects. I actually find that really useful because you can do things like duplicate experiments, and then all of your filters and all of the settings that you need can already be filled in. You can automatically exclude people who have taken other experiments within the project, but you're not necessarily excluding people from other projects where the experiments might be quite different. So it would be okay for participants to take multiple. So much of that stuff is a nightmare to handle manually. So, I mean, it's very, very nice that Prolific can do that automatically, and it just makes it easier to keep track of everything. I'm somebody who has millions of subfolders on my computer, so the fact that Prolific also allows me to have this kind of top-down organization, I really appreciate.
Yes, definitely. And if you were to tell someone in a similar position to you who's considering using FindingFive and Prolific, like what advice might you give that person if they're thinking about using the platforms together?
I mean, my advice generally is to go for it. The integration is really, really smooth. So this is going to depend somewhat on field, of course. Like I mentioned, FindingFive is definitely more optimized for studies in cognitive psychology, the cognitive sciences more broadly. But I mean, for most fields that do human subjects research, there's probably a way to get what you want. One thing that I'll also say really positively about FindingFive is that the team is extremely responsive. So there's a relatively small researcher user base right now. So if you're not sure how to do what you want and you're having trouble like reading the documentation or something, you can reach out. There's a forum, you can reach out to the customer support, and the team will respond like almost instantly, and usually with like a really nice tip. So you're kind of not on your own with FindingFive. This customer support is really, really good. So like most people in cognitive psychology, I would say like totally go for it. And again, the really, really seamless integration is so nice. I cannot stress that enough. When I was using other kinds of recruitment platforms, there was a lot of programming that went into talking between these systems. It was really, really easy to mess up. And it can just be really, really difficult with some other systems. But the FindingFive and Prolific integration is like really good, really easy to use.
Nice. That's good. Good to know. And in terms of like one of the recent projects that you've worked on, so you mentioned the one with bees and wasps and hearing the different sounds. Like, could you give us a little bit more detail about that specific project? So, like how many participants you were looking to recruit? Like, were there any aspects of the research that you thought were going to be challenging or that you needed to specifically overcome? And then what kind of findings you achieved in that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the challenge with any field of research is always more on the experimental design side, right? You can implement almost anything you want, but then you might realize afterwards that the design of your study doesn't actually allow you to answer the questions that you want, right? So the design side is always the biggest challenge for sure. So particularly in our studies where we're looking at these very kind of coarse-grained measures, you're just making a choice between one of two sounds that you heard. So we have to be really, really careful with exactly how we design the experiments. And so what we do in our lab is, this is where the computational part of computational psycholinguistics comes in. We do a lot of work trying to come up with different mathematical models of different strategies that people can use in our experiments, and specifically look for where they make different predictions in the exact kind of experiments that we run. So then we can run experiments with those particular properties, and then we know if we observe one pattern of behavioral results over another, then we're more supporting one theory versus another, right? So that's very abstract. Let me give like some actual concrete details here. So over the past year or so in our lab, we've been investigating these cases where people are listening to sentences. There's some acoustics, and there's also some sentence context that can allow you to interpret speech sounds. So some main kind of findings. So our first sort of major finding in the lab is that people always use both of these sources of information in their interpretation. So it's not really the case that they're relying just on what they hear or just on the context of the sentence. And this goes down to almost every single individual person in our experiment. You can look at a single participant, they're using both of these sources of information. At first, this might seem kind of surprising, right? Like if the task is to report what you heard, shouldn't you be listening for the acoustics? But that's not actually necessarily true. So if we look at a lot of theories of optimal perception, the prediction is that you should use all sources of information, even if they seem like they clash, right? Because on average, this is the strategy that actually leads to the highest accuracy. And it seems to be what we observe in our participants. So that's really cool. It seems like people are taking a statistically optimal approach to perception. So our subconscious minds are very smart. On the other hand, though, we found that people actually aren't fully optimal in how they do this. In particular, we found that people have kind of a difficult time tracking how reliable each of the sources of information are. So for example, if we throw some noise on top of the bees, peas word so that it's harder to discern the acoustics, people actually don't compensate by using the sentence context more, which we found very surprising, right? You would think if you have a harder time hearing, you should be paying more attention to the context. So this seems really counterintuitive, right? But doesn't seem to be the case. So right now, this is something we're investigating further, especially since there's a lot of people who have this intuition that, you know, as you age and your hearing gets worse, you're relying more on the context. And now we're wondering, like, is that actually true, right? Here we're looking at people with normal hearing, but they don't seem to do this compensatory thing. So it could be something that's more general. It could be something that is just specific to this one situation, but this is a really, really understudied area. So we have some collaborators who work with age-related hearing loss who we're now working to design studies with to see if there's kind of a similar effect. So this could potentially have practical applications, right? Like if the best thing is to use sentence context, can you train people, for example? Maybe that can help compensate for things like hearing loss.